You need defenses. But what type? The very best. The best? Matriculations! You can't handle the matriculations!
Oh, but I really want him.
Then here, have the matriculation shirt. Next best thing to a real castle. Available through Teespring, link in the description.
Shadowverse.
Greetings, I'm Shad, and welcome to my review of Fort Dawnguard from the Elder Scrolls Skyrim. And I'll be looking at how good of a fortress it is, how effectively designed it is in terms of its ability to repel attackers, but also its realism. I mean, could you actually build this structure in real life? And before we get into the meat of the review, I just want to talk briefly about if Fort Dawnguard actually qualifies as a castle. And it actually can, even though it's not fulfilling one of the main or more generally accepted requirements of a castle, and that is being, someone's individual residence. And generally this is a private citizen. And when I say private citizen, I'm meaning that it's not necessarily owned by the state. This is someone's home. And Fort Dawnguard isn't really that, though you could say it's the home of the leader of the Dawnguard, but more so this is actually a military base far, above it functioning as someone's home. I don't see a family being raised anywhere in Fort Dawnguard, nor is it functioning as a seat of power for a local authority. But that's the funny thing about the definitions of castles, is that it can be fairly loose because the definitions have changed over time. And there are some interesting parallels we can compare in regards to the function of Fort Dawnguard to real historical castles. And these are fortified historical structures that were defined and called castles, but they didn't function as an individual person's residence, nor were they owned by a private citizen, but they were actually more collectively owned or run, built even, by an organization. Best example that I can actually think of is actually Malbork Castle, which was the seat of power to the Teutonic Knights. Very interesting parallel in terms of function. The home base of a military organization, which is essentially what the Dawnguard is in Skyrim. So this is just one example of many examples that you can actually find of a historical castle that doesn't necessarily fit into the strict definitions of what a medieval castle was. So you are perfectly entitled in calling Fort Dawnguard a castle, but I find it interesting that it isn't necessarily even called castle in the context of the game, but it's called a fort or fortress, which is very much what it is. And so with that in mind, you are actually in your right to say Fort Dawnguard isn't a real authentic castle, it's a military fortress. So it goes either way, and you can pick what you would like to define it as. I'm also aware that additional wooden defenses are built the further you continue on in the game, to the point where they kind of build an additional palisade on the outside. And I'm actually not going to include that in my assessment of Fort Dawnguard for the simple reason that they're not really permanent. They're not actually part of the main design of the castle. This castle was really built and designed to be what we see here, with no real intention, I'm assuming, for any additional wooden battlements to be built on this walkway up. And it's kind of funny because the fact that there is a need to put wooden battlements and, palisades, walls and everything like that, it's like a concession on the game developer's part that they realize, yeah, this castle isn't really doing enough to defend this valley. There needs to be more, and I'll explain more about this as we continue on into the review. As always with all my castle reviews, before we go into the micro elements of the castle, for instance the style and design of its battlements, and even the medium-sized things like its layout, we're going to look at the macro, meaning the larger scale things, and that is location. Now, because Fort Dawnguard is actually located in kind of like a separated map, you can see how the world just ends when you go too far away from the mountains. And it's interesting, they do that for a number of reasons, and the mountains are there to block off your ability to see, it's the end of the world. Where am I? I'm in a simulation. This world isn't real. So I understand this is actually more of a gameplay mechanic than an actual defensible strategy in regards to how they designed the castle. They wanted it surrounded by mountains, so to block off view, basically, because this is not based in the main Skyrim world. And because of that, yeah, this is a very intriguing location for a castle, because you have this hidden, nestled away valley, literally in the middle of the mountains. In fact, to get access to this kind of area, you need to get to it through a cave. So this could be a great and also a terrible location for a castle, depending on a few factors. One factor is its secrecy. If no one knows how to, get to the castle, well, you've got awesome, ultimate, incredible defenses right there, just by the fact that no one can attack it because they can't find it. So there's that element to consider. The other element is that it has this, the most powerful bottlenecking capability for any enemy trying to attack it, so much so that it renders the main fortified castle kind of redundant in the sense that you don't need to fortify the parts where you're actually living. So if you build a home or even a barracks or whatever, you don't necessarily need to fortify that. Fortify the entrance, the cave. Put a massive, gatehouse, castle face on the entrance to the cave, and this is, if the location is known, it's not secret or hidden, because, of course, putting a big gatehouse is kind of an announcement saying, there is something behind here. But if you fortify that part, the only entrance to this hidden, nestled away valley, well, you've got profoundly effective defenses right there, and then you don't really need to fortify anything else. Fortify the main, entry point, which is a big fail with this design, like massive, because that entry point isn't fortified one bit. Mainly because I guess, is it secret? But everyone in Skyrim is saying, oh, the Dawnguard's reforming, the castle's just over here, go walk there. So everyone knows where the next castle is! And of course the vampires know as well, because they, send a tax to it. So yeah, the fact that that entrance is not fortified is a massive blunder. Like, massive. Which is also a big tragedy, because there are many opportunities to add additional layers to that type of fortification. One at the entrance of the cave? What about one at the exit as well? That could be really effective. I mean, just look at this crevice, okay, to where the cave exits out to into this valley. There's this long, narrow passage. You could add, like, 3 gatehouses along that narrow, neck, and just make it absolutely impossible for anyone to get through. And then after that, you've got this kind of windy section. You could put another gatehouse here, right? And then you have this windy section which leads to another narrow passage section in between the cliffs right here, where you could add another gatehouse. I mean, my goodness, that's castle right there. You wouldn't need anything else. That is, like, fortified to the max. And, like, look at the size of these mountains. For an army to, like, march over these mountains? No, it's not gonna happen. So the fact that the designers have actually put, like, a fortified structure here, while ignoring all the defensive advantages of the terrain, really speaks to a lack of knowledge in basically castle-style defenses, what they're supposed to do, okay? What's the mentality you need to work with in terms of fortifying a location or area to its best, level that it could achieve. And interestingly, we could almost leave the review right there, because the main castle body is not needed. You could get rid of it if you fortified all the other parts that I mentioned, and then I wouldn't need to look at the castle. But of course I am going to look at what they have here, go down to the micro elements of it, because that's what we like. We want to look at everything. And so the changes in terrain that would actually make a main fortified central kind of structure far more needed was if this was a more open valley. There were entrances, like the mountain wasn't there was entrances here, and there's kind of like a big valley, because the mountains themselves are basically functioning as the walls for a castle, so you don't really need walls, you just need to fortify the entry points. Anyway, so but if there was entry points everywhere and it's far more open, then this type of structure makes a lot more sense. Is this structure any good? Well, it's weird. It's very weird. The first weird thing is that it's kind of like one big, flat, long building when you look at it from the top, where the roof is just this flat kind, which actually undermines its design. Its micro elements and designs, the way the fortifications are designed, they look actually really cool. There's a lot of elements I like about it, with a big floor, which I will get to. But if you go to the macro, the largest size of things, it's basically 2 rectangles. A square with a circular kind of tower and then a rectangle off to the side, which is very uninventive and also not practical in terms of how you would design a castle. Impractical in what way? Well, see all this flat walking surface? You would need to make vaulted ceilings all underneath it to support this stone floor right here, which is a lot of work. Okay, so that alone makes it rather impractical. And what would really happen, instead of having all these, parts being part of the internal building, these external elements would actually be walls, okay? You would have like a rampart just here, and then it drops down to an open bailey on the inside, which is far easier to make and probably more effective in the long run as well. And this circular thing, instead of just sitting on the roof, this would be the main central keep behind the wall. Now, I would complain that and say, what's actually holding up this circle? It's just sitting on the roof. It has no proper support, referring to the main central tower here. But provision for its supports are kind of provided for in the internal layout and kind of not. The first problem with the internal layout in respect to comparing it to the external layout is that it doesn't match up, okay? It's like they designed the external layout and then they designed the internal layout and they didn't care about how the internal would fit, but that's actually quite in line with how Skyrim handles its buildings in general, where all the buildings are bigger on the inside. They've got the Doctor Who TARDIS effect. And the round dome on the inside of the building, which is supposed to be the base of this round tower here, is actually much bigger than the circumference of the tower is shown to be on the outside. So if we were to stand here, this is actually a smaller circle than the internal dome or entryway on the inside, which means, yes, this tower doesn't actually have any support on the inside. So that's another problem. I don't like its design. And then another weird, dumb thing is that why is the main body here built onto a kind of a square grid, where you have this square rectangle moving in, and then you have this square just sitting here, and they could say, well, it's to fit in with the line of the stonework here, but you could actually just have the wall go in a straight line from these two protruding towers, and that would give you more internal volume and space without that much additional work. An interesting thing to note about the kind of blocky design of Fort Dawnguard is the fact that when you, from your character's perspective, when you're looking at it walking up, gee, it looks impressive. You can't really notice the blocky nature from way down here. It looks like this massive, glorious fortress, and that is mainly due to the impressive style and design of the battlements. See those arrow loops and everything like here? Now, of course, I will assess them in far more detail a bit later on, but just from this perspective, the blocky design doesn't really stand out as a major problem because you don't really ever get to see the castle from such a high up perspective. You're always looking at it from down here, and from this angle, yeah, my goodness, this looks very, very nice. What about these two protruding towers here? I kind of like them, okay? This gives any of the defenders atop these towers a much greater field of fire. In fact, they could sit here at these arrow loops and fire at anyone trying to assail the main walls. And if any of the enemy actually does take one of these towers, well, look at what they have to deal with here. A tower right here with proper arrow loops firing right down on anyone who's taken it. So these protrusions are actually really cool. I like them a lot. They increase the defensibility of the castle in a significant way. They are effective, and in terms of how they're designed, really well. There's, a walkway straight out from the main line of the castle, taking advantage of the elevation of the castle with the towers. Yeah, very good. Of course, if they were able to make kind of like a wall, even though there's an archway and you can just walk through, they actually made that a solid wall and then continued it along here and had the wall connect to the mountain there, they would have made another division with this internal valley, which would have added the defenses even more. And if they put a proper, portcullis on it and stuff, maybe even a gatehouse, I dare say, but with this big circular tower here, that kind of actually gives it some gatehouse functionality. That would have increased the defenses, and they could have done it again, like the layers, the divisions that you could put on this valley, because it's just like this big long line from the entrance. You could have made this whole area so beastly in regards to its defenses that it could be impenetrable. But so many lost, opportunities. It's a great tragedy and pity. So that's the castle in terms of its larger layout structure, and yeah, there's only really one good thing about it, which is probably these side towers here. Having this raised central tower gives it some extra defenders some additional field of fire, but the fact that it's sitting on the wall, no, I don't like it. So overall, I'm pretty disappointed with the design here. And if you combine that with the missed opportunities of just its location, unfortunately, Fort Dawnguard is not looking too good in terms of how good of a design it is. But perhaps it can get some saving grace with its micro designs. Like, look at how these battlements are designed. First, very aesthetically cool, okay, what we see here. And something that's quite interesting is you see these arrow loops going along, and these arrow loops are everywhere. Like wherever there's a rampart, there are arrow loops. And the interesting thing about this design, these arrow loops are essentially crenellations that have simply been sealed off on the top. So you have the Merlons, creating the crenelles in between, and then they've just put stonework above it, which is turning the crenelles in between the Merlons into arrow loops. And so this is of course a legitimate battlement, and you could still call them crenellations, or you could actually call them arrow loops, but they're giving the same function. Very effective, very well done, and it gives it a unique style. The fact that they've put stonework above the individual Merlons, making these arrow loops, a really cool, unique visual style, which gives Fort Dawnguard that feeling. It's got Fort Dawnguard, a very unique feeling, very cool, big thumbs up. The other thing is this is a bit of an impressive attention to detail, right? See how they have the arrow loops here. Notice at the bottom of it, the bottom has been kind of cut off at an angle. Why is that? Well, if we were to just, go through the wall here, it gives the defender standing on top of the wall an ability to fire down at a steeper angle. Have a look, right down. And so if this part was cut off, they would not be able to fire down to any area underneath here. Have a look, that's the difference. And so by cutting out a portion of the lower part of these arrow loops, they increase the defender's field of fire considerably, which is a very good effective design. A nice, little bit of detail they've added. But of course there is still a problem, and that is when the attackers get even closer to the walls, because the defenders, they can only get to, about as close as here, and if they get any closer to the walls, well, look, they can't shoot down at them. If only there was like a structural design feature that would enable you to fire down at people much closer to the line of the wall underneath. Like if people are, attacking the walls and they get right up to say where this guy is standing, okay? Can he actually be fired down from there? Yes, additional field of fire from the side tower is good. What if I get even closer? What if I get like here? Oh, look at that. I am perfectly protected by everyone atop the walls. Now, of course, you know what I'm referring to, what this is all leading up to. Because, of course, there was a design feature made to fix that problem. And audio and headphone warning, you know what it is. They are matriculation! And the most annoying thing about Dawnguard is that they have architecturally included the provision, the ability to add the matriculations in without even knowing the purpose of these. So look, see here, the battlement? See how you have these corbels leading up to these small archways, supporting the battlement above, so the battlement was able to have been extended that little bit further out from the top of the rampart. That's all there, so you could have, gaps in between, underneath, right here, so they would have been able to fire down from the ramparts to people close to the walls, but they didn't add it in. That is the whole purpose of adding these things in, but of course, they've added them in because of aesthetics, the looks. Like, this feature has become an iconic visual style, and people added in for that visual style without realizing the functional reason this design was even created in the first place. Have a look. There's no gap there at all. It's completely stoned off, making this feature purely aesthetic, completely useless in terms of its defensive design. Showing that whoever designed these very visually pleasing battlement designs didn't understand proper castle defenses. That's a big fail there. And here's another fail, right here. See how there is steps leading up to the entrance, which means the entrance, the actual doorway, is elevated from the ground. But it's elevated by at least 2 meters, right? So they could have, instead of putting the stairs right there, put the stairs right about here, where my character is standing. And they could have put in a drawbridge, which would have added more defenses. Instead of just having a wall here, there's definitely enough room above to fit in a portcullis, which is another fail. Fort Dawnguard, you have failed. You're fired. In fact, this is amongst the worst designed fortresses and castles that exist in Skyrim. And Skyrim, there's been some pretty bad designs, so it's amongst some bad company right there. But don't get me wrong, I mean, Whiterun had some pretty big flaws as well, but at least it had internal divisions and walls and whatnot. It actually had a drawbridge at one location, didn't have any battlements and stuff. That was a big flaw, but that was, you know, Whiterun. But still, yeah, Dawnguard, massive fail as well. This is a piece of junk. And there we go. This has been my realism and practicality review of Fort Dawnguard from the Elder Scrolls Skyrim. Thanks for watching, guys. I do hope you enjoyed. It's always fun to make these, fantasy castle reviews. I hope to see you on my next video, and until then, farewell.